Sri Amit Gupta has addressed the Center for Policy Studies on 4 occasions, earlier in April 2014, and spoke on why we do when we do. In the November in the same year on crafting foreign policy. His third lecture a year later was on the governance through participation, and the last was on the India's higher education challenge in the February 6, 2018. It is always a pleasure to hear Sri Das Gupta ji, who speaks with authority on any subject. Center for Policy Studies and Visakhapatnam Public Library are deeply honored to Sri Das Gupta ji for sparing his valuable time for us for the evening. Now I request Professor Prasanna Kumar Garu to come and occupy the chair in the dais and preside over the meetings.
Amit Das Gupta ji, Shri Verma, esteemed friends, on behalf of Center for Policy Studies and on my own behalf, I extend a very cordial welcome to all of you. I need not repeat what I had said earlier. Shri Amit ji knows about it, that at our meetings, nobody presides. Even the president of Center for Policy Studies doesn't preside. For 2 reasons. Reason number 1, it's a distraction to the audience. One fellow sitting there and then scratching his head into the tone. And secondly, if I sit in the audience, I'll be able to enjoy the lecture much better. For these 2 reasons, I crave your indulgence, your permission to remain unseated on the dais. Thank you very much. Now, for the last 4 years, I think Sri Amit ji has been in touch with us for 5 years almost. He and Madam have addressed our center. The first one was on crafting foreign policy. The second, the philosopher in him surfaced when he spoke on why we do what we do. It's a very profoundly stimulating lecture. Why we do what we do. And the third was on good governance. And the last was on challenges in the field of higher education. I greatly admire his skill of public speaking. Soft, gentle, humorous, and very profound in what he says. And it's a humbling experience to be in his company, because an ambassador of repute, a very wise man, very learned man, and he has chosen today the subject. I was unwise in suggesting to him that he may make a reference to India and its neighborhood, but then I retreated for obvious reasons. Because what is important in this theme he has chosen is not challenges to diplomacy, but the word contemporary. That is a very important word, in my opinion. Why? I would just like to reflect on it for a while without trying to preempt your presentation. I just want to say a few words about this, having been a student of international relations and foreign policy. Contemporary in the sense, how contemporary is contemporary? That's the question. What has been happening in the last 4 or 5 years? You all know that 20th century was far different from 21st century. And this age is called post-truth. Illiberal state, illiberal populism it is called. What is the reason for this? When we taught international relations to students, we used to refer to Clausewitz and his famous exposition of the dynamics of international relations. War and peace, and Clausewitz were was influenced greatly by the European Enlightenment, those ideas, Enlightenment ideas. Then from the 19th and 18th centuries, from Mazzini, Garibaldi and others, you come to the 20th century. And then you come to the 20th century, you had a very different situation altogether. Though two great wars, two horrendous wars, the First and Second World War, devastated humanity, killed millions of people, those two wars, something extraordinary happened. There was from America a president by name Woodrow Wilson. We particularly feel happy because he was a professor of public administration, government. Woodrow Wilson came to Paris and started a new era in international relations, diplomacy, etc., etc. Such was the euphoria created by Mr. Wilson. I was very fond of repeating it. Wilson, those days television was not there, luckily. Cell phone was not there. And whatever information came to Europe, it came only through newspapers. And Wilson was the most admired leader in the world. Europe, devastated by the First World War, looked up to Wilson to be the Messiah of peace. He was a little pompous also. He came as a Messiah, spoke as a Messiah, and came with famous 14 points. 14 points to save the world. And those 14 points, Clemenceau was the French Prime Minister, mischievous French Prime Minister. There is a theory, Hirsute theory. I don't want to digress. The Hirsute theory says in Russia, every leader alternates between a bald leader and a man with huge shock of hair. Hirsute theory in Russia. Clemenceau was a bald man and a very humorous man. So when Mr. Wilson came and said 14 points for world peace, people started admiring him. As the historian very rightly said, very aptly said, women fainted out of joy, youth shouted in amazement, people lined up to meet this great Messiah of peace coming from the United States of America. Naturally, the French Prime Minister was a little envious of Wilson. Who is this fellow coming from America telling us? And Wilson was a hero in Europe. But short-lived heroism, though it was. Then it was Clemenceau who said, oh, this man has come with 14 points. God has 10 points. This man is not satisfied with 14 points, he said. God is satisfied with 10 commandments, but this man is not satisfied with 14. Now, I wish to mention this because Wilson set a new trend in international relations, a new diplomacy. That was a different trend altogether. And that continued for quite some time because of people like Roosevelt, great American presidents, as somebody said, from Woodrow Wilson, 1920, to Barack Obama, till recently, 4 years ago, every American president was a messenger of peace and an astute diplomat, interested in peace, etc. Now things started changing. What happened? The Americans, you will be surprised to know that the most disliked person in America is Donald Trump. And the liberal press is anti-liberal. The liberal press, the Economist for that matter, of all journals, world's leading weekly, came out with an editorial. It said, let us not allow Trump to become the President of America. A leading journal writing, appealing to the people not to elect Trump as the President of America. And then another journal came up with another article, 2018 is the last year for American President Trump. What happened to Nixon would happen to Trump. That was wishful thinking. And when people from America went on saying, for instance, I had inputs from my son who said, if Trump contests today, he would win hands down. It would happen. Now the reason is, that is important, there is a new wave of nationalism sweeping across the globe. That's a very interesting thing that is sweeping across India also in a different form though, a different form of identity. And this new wave of nationalism sweeping across the world, who are the champions of this new wave of authoritarian, arrogant? Today, ladies and gentlemen, a little while ago I was telling Mr. Verma that leaders at both macro and micro level tend to be authoritarian these days. Dynasty and authoritarianism have become very important factors in modern day governance. Now therefore, these are examples. Trump in America, Putin in Russia, Erdogan in Turkey, Kim Jong in North Korea. I don't want to add the fifth name that's supposed to be in circulation. That's not the function of a responsible presentation on this occasion. Now these people are very authoritarian. Our Indian Prime Minister also added a new kind of dimension to diplomacy, which is called huggomacy. Hugging people, and then there's typical North Indian way of displaying affection. And people say this huggomacy of Mr. Modi, it is also referred to in journals as a very important development. And in these conditions, what is the latest challenge? That is why Amit Gupta ji very rightly chose the word contemporary. All of us, why are we bothered about what is happening diplomatically? Why, for instance, Trump is doing something to some other country, Putin is doing something. You believe me, Putin is more dangerous than Stalin according to somebody. Stalin was a myth. Stalin was not so crafty. Stalin was not so cunning. Stalin was not a warlord of ambitions, wanting ambitions. He was not a warlord of wanting ambitions. Putin is. North Korean president is. Chinese prime minister, leader is, secretaries for that matter. Today you find at the global level, all leadership is concentrated in the hands of people with alarmingly hurtful ambitions for humanity. That is the situation. So it is an age of illiberal populism, it is called. It is populism, but illiberal populism. So this illiberal populism in this age, what are the challenges to diplomacy? Interestingly, 2 or 3 articles appeared in the Hindu of today, how diplomacy can solve the India-Pakistan problem. It's easy to suggest, go and do it and all that. But diplomacy is the field of Amit Gupta ji. He's the expert in this. He knows the nuances of it, the challenges facing diplomacy. Basic questions the audience would ask, perhaps you would expect them to ask, is there a solution to what is happening in the subcontinent? Will peace ever return to the subcontinent? Or do we have to live with this nagging, what you call, irritant called occasional terrorism, but regular war by proxy? These are the challenges facing, in my humble opinion. Thank you very much. I have not, I have preempted you from saying anything on the field. He's an expert, a practitioner of diplomacy, and also a scholar. He has been teaching in Australia. You still are teaching in Australia, sir? Yeah, he's teaching in Australia. He loves to teach. And we as teachers love to hear you. Thank you very much. And the floor is yours. It will be followed by an interactive session. There is no time limit. Shri Amit Gupta ji. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Prasanna Kumar. Let me first begin by expressing my deep gratitude for the opportunity to be part of the Center for Policy Studies and at the VISAKHAPATNAM Public Library once again. It's always been a privilege, and I have consciously decided that every time I visit Visakhapatnam, you would be the first person, Professor Prasanna Kumar, to know. And should you feel that I could contribute to the center's work through an interactive session, yours would be the first call that I would take. Your scholasticism, your depth of knowledge, your humility and your graciousness have always distinguished you from others. And for me, it is an honor and a privilege to be here today. As I had mentioned the last time when I came, it's an inspiration to also see the Visakhapatnam Public Library in its current incarnation. When I visited for the first time, it was to listen to an outstanding lecture by Commodore Uday Bhaskar. And thereafter, when I did speak on a couple of other occasions, the Visakhapatnam Public Library had a different ambiance to it. Today, as Verma ji has told me, it is through the collective effort and aspirations of each and every one of you that this possibly stands as a landmark example of why we do what we do. I fully recognize that you may have a number of questions which are related to various issues: Indo-Pakistan, India, neighborhood, SAARC, India's relationship with China, USA. I'm happy to respond to each and every one of them. But I thought what I would do is to begin by giving you, or setting, if you like, a paradigm and a framework by which I see the world, and therefore the basis by which I hope I might be able to convince you on how diplomacy as we have known it needs to undergo a fundamental change. Professor Prasanna Kumar's erudition and his knowledge has been such that he has actually said much of what I was going to say. But I will take what he has said and reposition it within the framework that I have in mind. My first premise, and my only premise, is that all processes and instruments of intervention that we have need to undergo a modification depending on the external environment. In other words, any strategy that we adopt cannot be a static strategy. Something that worked 5 years ago may not work today. Something that worked yesterday may not work in an environment that changes. When we interact with players, a strategy of dealing with one set of players may actually not work when you're dealing with a completely different set of players. Your negotiation needs to undergo modifications depending not only on the circumstance, but also on the opposite players. In other words, diplomacy, which is a strategy, needs to undergo modifications. To my mind, there is a distinction between diplomacy, which is what diplomats do, and foreign policy. Foreign policy, if I were to crudely or simplistically define it, is a way by which we pursue our strategic objectives, or what we identify as our key national self-interest, on the basis of negotiation, on the basis of making and winning friends, but with a view to avoiding conflict and, if possible, war. Now that essentially and broadly is what foreign policy is. So what a diplomat does is to try and implement this foreign policy. So in as much as foreign policy, which means my perception of my strategic national interest, also changes, diplomacy must also change. And so this, for me, is the reason why I'm using the word contemporary, and I will explain this to you in more detail. Let's take, for example, the role of a doctor. Now, a surgeon operates on the human body. And you would say that a person is a good surgeon depending on his or her rate of success. Similarly, a cricket player is a great cricket player if he or she is able to play the game as per expectation and with high rates of success. But one of the most fundamental disruptions that have taken place is the introduction of technology. Today, a number of the most complex operations are not carried out by the human hand, but are actually carried out by robots. And it is argued that these robots are able to carry out surgery which is so sophisticated that the human hand is unable to deal with it. This means that the role of the surgeon needs to undergo a shift. I had argued when I spoke here last on the challenges that India faces in the higher education space by saying that the mobile phone that each and every one of you has actually has more information in it, thanks to the internet, than all the teachers of the world put together. And this is a technological development. And it's a development that people like you have actually created. It's not something that has just emerged out of the earth. We ourselves are creating an environment that is disruptive. It is disruptive in many ways in a positive manner. It is disruptive in a negative manner if we are not able to embrace and utilize it. So very often in the higher education space, for example, if the teacher is not reinvented, teaching cannot be reinvented. Similarly, if the diplomat does not reinvent himself or herself to understand challenges, then I believe that diplomats can become irrelevant. So efficiency will be enhanced depending on the shift that we make when we rethink what is diplomacy. Let me give you some examples. One of the most critical challenges that all of us face is the challenge of uncertainty. And all of us face it in life. Some levels of uncertainty we don't bother too much about because we consider it an acceptable level of uncertainty and possibly a predictable level of uncertainty. I'll give you an example. I'm leaving tomorrow morning. I have to get to the airport. My flight is at 8 o'clock in the morning. I'm told that there's a construction that's going on with a flyover that's being made, and what it will do is disrupt my travel time. So I ask myself, how predictable is this? I know it's predictable. There could be a disruption. So how do I manage my uncertainty? I have just a hand baggage. I have my boarding pass, which means I don't need to stand in the queue. So I start looking at uncertainty and I start managing this uncertainty. If I am not able to manage it, it's called risk. So risk is the impact that uncertainty has on achieving my end objective. So with a high level of risk, diplomacy is not able to achieve the end result of foreign policy. So if foreign policy is the achievement of my strategic national interest, risk is if I am unable to achieve it. So if you keep this as a significant backdrop, much of what I will say will fall into place. Now let's talk about uncertainty, and Professor Prasanna Kumar very rightly mentioned about President Donald Trump. Now President Donald Trump, even before he became President of the United States, repeatedly said that US foreign policy will be unpredictable. We would like the world to know that we are unpredictable. Now this is something that he has already told us. In other words, you have the piece of the puzzle which tells you that this is how it's going to happen. Alright? So do I make sense in that? So if we know unpredictability is going to be the basis of his foreign policy, we need to ask ourselves, how do we adjust? So let me give you two instances of disruption that takes place. Significant disruption that impacts diplomacy. Now, one of the examples of uncertainty is that it needs to be within a predictable band. So all of us know that life is uncertain, but we are able to accept it if it's within a predictable band. During the years of the Cold War, for example, if Russian tanks were moved in East Berlin, the Russian commanders would ring up the Allied commanders and tell them, look, hang on, don't worry about it. This is not an offensive movement of our tanks. We are moving it for administrative reasons. Now, this actually took away uncertainty. If the tanks were being moved without this conversation, it would have been immediately seen and perceived as a threat. Now, this degree of communication came essentially as a follow-through of many other actions that took place, and one of them was the Cuban Missile Crisis. So after the Cuban Missile Crisis, both Washington and Moscow decided that if there are activities that we are undertaking which are not of an offensive nature, we will inform each other. Risk, in other words, came within a predictable band. Our diplomacy is based, at least the diplomacy that I grew up with, drew from what was known as the Westphalian model. And one of the things we did, there was a protocol that was followed. The diplomat, you met other diplomats, you collected information, you sent it back to Delhi, you gave your assessment report, and then you gave your recommendations. If your foreign minister or your prime minister were visiting his or her counterpart, you similarly made recommendations. You drew up a brief in which you analyzed everything. Today this doesn't happen. And it doesn't happen because President Donald Trump can pick up the phone and speak directly to Prime Minister Modi. It doesn't happen because heads of state and government do not consult anymore. And one of the great set of articles that has just been available, you can read them in the Foreign Affairs magazine, Foreign Affairs journal that's brought out, is that the unpredictability with regard to President Donald Trump is not the unpredictability of his statements or his actions. The unpredictability is that you do not have any sense of continuity with regard to his political advisors. So it's not that you don't know what President Trump is going to do, because you know. What you know is that he's brought in uncertainty into the picture. You cannot predict his actions. But you've also brought in uncertainty with regard to the other negotiators in Washington. And that enhances risk. And it enhances it so significantly that in your crafting of foreign policy and in the crafting of diplomacy, it is significantly disrupted. Now this is a critical point I make, because one of the things that we were used to was communication and the speed of communication, which was a slow speed of communication. And as Professor Prasanna Kumar said, there was a time when we relied only on newspapers and on face-to-face conversations. There was no television, there was no mobile phone. I don't know how many of you watch Netflix, but there's a series in the Netflix called The Crown. And there's an episode there when John F. Kennedy has been assassinated. And in England, the Queen needs to be informed. But the Queen is in her castle in some place in the outskirts. And there is this messenger and a group of messengers who have to ride across to get to the Queen. It takes time. Today it takes an SMS. And it is the speed of communication that is so significantly disruptive that you need to be able to adapt and adjust to it. Several years ago, when I was in Geneva for a meeting on the WTO, and I was giving a talk, actually. I was told to stop. And someone said that everyone wants to watch television. You have a wonderful talk, I'm sure, but no one wants to listen to it. And I remember leaving the auditorium with all the people, and the television cameras were on, the television stations were on, the CNN, 9/11 had just taken place, and the planes had just gone into the Twin Towers. Now, while this was happening, telegrams were flying up and about across the globe. People were being told, please write condolence messages, messages of support. The Prime Minister of India has to write to the President of the United States and say how shocked and horrified we are. And we were sitting and actually scribbling all this down, as I'm sure my Jamaican colleague would have been doing, or my Sri Lankan colleague. But my Chinese colleagues across the globe didn't do it. And so when you watch television, and you watch that historic scene in which the President of the United States says, we have heard you, now you will hear us. It is us versus them. And everyone was waving the American flag. Those flags were printed in Beijing, and they were shipped overnight to the United States. The communication that took place in a matter of seconds disrupted reactions to foreign policy. They disrupted diplomatic interventions. And I think it's important to recognize how communication now is a significant player in diplomacy, the speed of communication. But the speed of communication has another core element to it, because it is based on a carrier which is the internet. And in the internet, one of the things that has come up is the social media, and how significant this social media is in terms of affecting the way we think. You all have heard about the Arab Spring, which started in Tunisia and then moved from Tunisia across Libya, across Yemen, and regime changes actually took place. The social media, this was disrupted when a man called Bozagi burned himself to death, self-immolation as it is called, and it was done on live camera, and it was broadcast on social media. That became the tipping point for the revolution in Tunisia. It is not only the speed of communication, but the fact that today that communication reaches audiences outside the diplomat. It reaches audiences outside foreign affairs ministries and governments. It now co-opts the public. And when it co-opts the public, foreign policy becomes a strange instrument, strange objective, and diplomacy now needs to start discussing not just with other diplomats, but with your own people. Today, the public perception following the attack on the bus, the tragic attack on the bus, is how will our people expect us to react? That is a very core and driving factor in foreign policy and in the diplomatic actions that the government will initiate. So you've introduced an additional level of uncertainty. The negotiations are no longer government to government, diplomat to diplomat, but actually through social media, through print media, through visual media, with your own people. For the first time, you decide that people are equally important. For many years, and this is not just India, for many years, countries across the world believed that their diplomats were supreme. New Delhi discussed the policies of India's relationship with Sri Lanka in New Delhi. They did not discuss the relationship that New Delhi and Dhaka would have with the people in the northeast of India or West Bengal. It was done within small groups where we discussed among each other. I knew the viewpoint of my colleagues I spoke to. whether they were in the Foreign Service or think tanks which we co-opted to tell us what we wanted to hear. For the first time, elements were introduced. And this was introduced, it's called the New Diplomacy. The New Diplomacy, which was conceptualized essentially by a man called Joseph Nye, many years ago in the United States, who believed that you had two kinds of diplomacy that needed to live side by side. One was your conventional diplomacy, or what people may call traditional diplomacy. And the other was public diplomacy. And in public diplomacy, you actually engaged with people to tell your own story. And when we are talking about President Wilson and Theodore Roosevelt, they are the ones who after the Second World War made a historic comment. They said the world needs to know America's story. And if we don't tell the story well, no one will understand what America is all about. This is the basis of public diplomacy. Some call it soft power. Soft power was really a way of winning over, not other governments, winning over people. Because today it was recognized, and by the today I mean the earlier today, it was recognized that the players that you had to discuss with needed to be expanded. And it is this expansion of players that starts impacting diplomacy. Soft power diplomacy, or what we call public diplomacy, cannot stand in contradiction to traditional diplomacy, but is meant to complement it. But how do they work together? When do we consult people? When do we feel we don't need to consult the people? These become very critical questions, and they in fact become challenges to the way diplomacy's success or failure is perceived. After all, if a surgeon is gauged on the basis of the number of successful operations she or he has conducted, diplomacy's success is based on perception. And perception is based on communication. So what is communicated in terms of actions taken and therefore end objectives met is how the public sees the diplomat's role. And the diplomat cannot naturally operate against the government's wishes. So the government's instructions are relayed through foreign policy to the diplomat to execute. To my mind, these challenges force diplomats to reinvent diplomacy. Let me give you some other examples to suggest this. There are unique new subjects which are being brought onto the table, which were earlier not subjects that diplomats talked about. One of them is terrorism. And terrorism today has become the basis of most bilateral discussions. It's not just the fact of terror, but it is the fact of wanting to brand certain countries or certain organizations as terror organizations. It is linked with what actions can be taken subsequent to that branding, whether it is in terms of money laundering operations, how do you tighten, how do you introduce sanctions, what are the rules of the game. Terrorism has therefore taken a completely new dimension. Terrorism also impacts visa policies. And visa policies are part and parcel of what diplomats do on their everyday life. Other areas that I can mention to you. The multilateral trading regulations. There was a time when, GATT made the transition to WTO. And the whole idea behind this transition to WTO was to have market access in a freer environment. Now, all of a sudden, various developed countries felt that many countries in the poorer world were being able to produce products into their markets at a much cheaper price. And so they needed to create barriers to trade. In other words, barriers that would prevent market access. Several instruments were picked up. One of these was child labor. And they said any product that is produced by a country or by a company which does not follow the norms and regulations developed by developed countries, their products will not be allowed. In the construction industry, for example, under this garb of occupational safety and health, a series of measures were introduced which talked in terms of the kind of clothes that people would need to wear, the helmets that they would need to wear, the gloves that they would need to wear, and frankly, these all sound very good. Good ideas to introduce. But these were also ideas meant to prevent market access. After all, in Bangladesh, the companies that exploit children are companies that are born, brought up in developed countries, whether it's Walmart or you can list them all out. All the tragedies that have happened of late in many of the developing countries are because the developed country companies have actually exploited conditions in the poorer countries. This is now part of diplomacy, because we are now not just engaged, as we were saying, in terms of looking at strategic national interests, big ideas, talking with diplomats, negotiating. Now you're looking at nitty-gritty of trade. Take another element, climate change. The impact that climate change is having in terms of policies, whether it is the import of coal, in the case of India specifically, that without the import of coal and therefore fossil fuel, our growth can actually be retarded. And to be told, please replace it by renewables, is not something that's going to happen overnight. There's a famous statement by President Bush during the climate change negotiations when he said that I will not compromise on the standard of living of the American people by cutting down on emissions and other forms that are required by the Kyoto Protocol. So if I have to leave my air conditioning system on the whole night and not be in that room, and that is the luxury that I'm used to, that is what I will do. And it is now demonstrated and proved that a lot of difficulties caused to the environment by the developed world are to be corrected by the developing world. This is a new job for the diplomat. Add further to this the role of China and the manner in which China is developing, not just in terms of a hegemonic power, not just in terms of the manner in which Xi Jinping is positioning himself. I'm talking about other areas. Did you know, for example, that most of the countries in the world, whether it is in Africa or Southeast Asia, are economically locked in, including Australia, by the way. They are economically locked in with China. If China were to withdraw the money that they have put into the economies of these countries, even Australia would collapse. And it is this locking that now becomes one of the most critical negotiating gambits for the diplomat when you discuss the role of China. So you cannot see it in isolation in terms of this is a hegemonic country, they're going to take over the Pacific, the South China Seas dispute will be handled. Very critical. How do you resolve it? How do you realistically see the future of a world in which China is contained? And should you therefore contain China? These become fundamental and key questions that we are all facing. I'll give you another challenge. You see, when India became independent and Prime Minister Nehru decided that non-alignment was the policy that he wanted to follow, and then years later a fundamental paradigm shift took place in foreign policy when we signed the 1-2-3 agreement with the Americans. This is really a shift between what I call strategic distancing, which is non-alignment, and strategic proximity, which is where we are today. And in strategic proximity, Who you're going to be close to at what point of time depends on the perceptions you have of your strategic national interest. Someone had very wisely said that there are no permanent friends. I think it's also very wise to say there are no permanent enemies. And what happens in this whole process is that continuity is no longer a factor that you take into consideration. Uncertainty is the factor that you embed in diplomacy. And when you put in uncertainty as one of the instruments on the basis of which you will craft your equations, then it is a shift in the manner in which you think diplomacy is. I'll give you one last example before I stop. There was a time a few years ago, almost 20 years ago, when the word globalization slowly came into our vocabulary. It was first used by a man called Professor Immanuel Wallerstein, and he wrote a book called The World Economic System. And Professor Wallerstein, who was my professor, argued that the growth of capitalism would be such that economies across the globe would get interlocked. And by referring to a world economic system, this became or constituted the basis of what came to be known as economic globalization. We faced a serious problem in economic globalization when the East Asian financial crisis took place and the collapse of the Thai baht at one end of the world impacted economies in Brazil, in Latin America. So Brazil was impacted, Argentina, and this crisscrossing, this fact that geography is now history. No one talks about it, because geography can be crossed with the press of a button. Economic globalization then required checks and balances. But simultaneously, technological revolutions took place. And concepts like social globalization entered. And people in India were sitting and watching programs on television which were being broadcast in the US. And this was the flow, if you like, of a cultural invasion. Significantly, human thinking started to shift and change. Today we accept, if you pick up any management literature, one of the things in most business schools that is taught to everybody is how in a work environment you should deal with cultural diversity. And the argument is that you will sit in Visakhapatnam, your boss will be sitting in Tokyo, your accountant may be Spanish but living in Zambia. And you will not have physical space. It'll be a virtual office. And the understanding today is that this new work environment, which brings together everyone, requires that you understand the manner in which the Japanese think because he's your boss, the manner in which the Chinese work because she's your receptionist, the manner in which the Brazilian would work, the manner in which the Spanish, like all Bengalis, would like to sleep in the afternoon. How do you adjust with all this? We are told that this is critical for the success of globalization. But you would have noticed that after 9/11, very creepingly, countries which said, bring down fortresses and fortress walls, actually started erecting them. And nationalism, as Professor Prasanna Kumar so rightly brought out, is becoming the mainstay of government policy. Make America great again is not a bad decision. It is the kind of thing American people would want from the American president. And I think it's a legitimate aspiration of the American people. But from the developed countries which said, dismantle all barriers to markets, open up your economy, open up your system of governance, open up systems by which the free flow of ideas can take the world to another step. That is now shifted. That is now changed. Migration itself is being impacted dramatically. One of the greatest attacks on Chancellor Angela Merkel of Germany was that she had no hesitation in the German economy taking a negative impact, but she was not going to compromise on taking in refugees from countries where death was likely to happen along with torture if she didn't do so. That disrupted Europe's thinking on asylum seekers. The disruption was so severe that it actually led across Europe, in France, in Germany, across Europe, into the rise of rightist groups. Nationalism is likely now to disrupt globalization. Now, for the diplomat, these are fundamental challenges to diplomacy. And unless diplomacy is rethought, I think diplomats will become irrelevant. It's a great pleasure talking to you, and I look forward to taking questions. Once again, Professor Prasanna Kumar, thank you for your indulgence in having me here. It's wonderful.
The floor is open for an interactive session. And classrooms we used to say diplomacy is how do you do, foreign policy is what you do, in simple terms, because we were not as profound as we are today. Now, you refer to the disruptions. The first disruption that took place in the Industrial Revolution 200 years ago, the second, the Information Revolution, and the third, the artificial intelligence, robots, etc., etc. Now, in this context, questions are invited. I have a few questions which I will quite rightly place for your consideration at the end of the session. Interactive session, friends, any questions you would like to put to the distinguished guest? It's a profoundly stimulating, thought-provoking, needless to say, a highly educated experience for me. I was a student for 1 hour in your class. Thank you very much.
Could you hear me?
Yes.
I am V.R. Rao. I am an engineer basically. When we were youngsters about 50 years back, most of the charmed, the top people of the IAS people used to be IFS. And now we don't hear much about IFS at all, and IAS people have taken over the most of the activities of the district. Will you please enlighten us what must have happened during these years? Thank you.
I mean, you're very right. I mean, when people take the civil services examination, I think the students who are taking these examinations have different reasons for taking them. And I remember when I was asked at the interview as to why I wanted to join the Foreign Service, I said because I wanted to travel. I wanted to meet different people. I wanted to eat different kind of food. I wanted to learn a different language, to open myself to different cultures. That was the only driving force I had. I was not interested in, it never occurred to me at that stage to even say things like, I want to lead a better life. So I never joined the Foreign Service because it was going to be an economically profitable thing to do. Or that colleagues that I'm aware of who joined the IAS or the police service or whatever because it was an economically profitable thing to do. But I think as times shift and change, priorities or the objectives by we do things do undergo a modification. The Indian Foreign Service still continues to be, and this is recorded by diplomats across the globe, whether by the Israelis or by the Americans or the Chinese, the Europeans consider the Indian Foreign Service to be among the best in the world. We're also among the smallest in the world. So for 22,000 diplomats, for example, in China, we have less than 1,000. And I think we do a reasonably good job.
Sir, recently, you have seen the incident, Roma incident. The papers are daily coming up with this is only an election affair. It is not actually, they have not done anything. India is very tight in all those things. What is our opinion?
I missed the last one.
He is referring to the propaganda that you were reading about surgical strikes and recent Pulwama post-Pulwama attack. Is it all propaganda or surgical action?
I think there is a twofold response to that. One is I personally believe that, and I need to go by what statements were made by my colleague, have been made by my colleague who is the Foreign Secretary of India, and in his view, a successful operation has been carried out, and I see no evidence for me to challenge that statement of the Foreign Secretary and thus of the government. I also believe that speculation is something that is rampant not just in India but across the globe. You would be aware that less than 48 hours ago there has been a series of writings that have taken place by a gentleman who believes that one of the Taliban leaders, who was known as the one-eyed Taliban leader, that he died in Afghanistan, and he died and he was very, very ill, and that he lived in a safe house and was under great secret protective custody. All documents that were published prior to that argued that the death did not occur in Afghanistan. Now it is your guess, as it is my guess, as to which one of these two are factually correct. And you can make that assessment only when the facts are available to you and put before you. There was a great set of writings that were carried in the New York Review of Books, in which the journalists were able to get access to documentation from Washington, which conclusively proved that the American government was aware well in advance, including Donald Rumsfeld and President Bush, that there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq before Iraq was bombed. Whether this is something you want to believe or not believe will remain a matter of historical conjecture. But I believe what my Foreign Secretary has said is based on facts that he had before him.
Sir, this is about Pulwama attack. Whether Pulwama attacks, surgical strike. So whether Pakistan has overtaken India diplomatically over the issue?
Whether Pakistan
has overtaken India diplomatically, because the President Khan is in the news worldwide that he is very sympathetic towards India, leaving the pilot and all those things. It appears that Pakistan has diplomatically taken a lead in that aspect. That's what I believe, sir. Can you say something about it?
Look, I have. It's a terrible thing for me as a human being to make a statement like this, and as a former diplomat. But I do believe that because of a series of factors, Islamabad and Pakistan, but more importantly, the people of Pakistan are carrying an extraordinary burden. This is a burden which is based in history, but it is also a burden of contemporary living. And that is an economic burden, a social burden, a security burden, I do not believe that the Pakistani people do not aspire for a better life. I simply don't believe this. I believe that the Pakistani people, just like you and I, aspire for a better life. But this is a life that has been denied to them for decades. Of course, there are many who are doing extremely well and who are financially very well off, who probably shop in London and have lunch in Paris. But that's not all of Pakistan. I also believe that in the process, several actions have taken place which are part of history. Actions that happened with regard to Afghanistan, which have had a spillover and an impact in Pakistan itself. Terror groups that exist in Pakistan terrorize Pakistanis as well. And many Pakistani men, women and children have lost their lives. I do not therefore believe that Pakistan has an upper hand on India on the diplomatic front. Internationally, it has been isolated. The question I would ask is whether the continued isolation of Pakistan is to India's interest. I believe it is not. I believe that if you want, you're not going to be able to change geography. It becomes critical for India to achieve its own end objectives by recognizing that the neighborhood is important. But if you ask me, if you want to talk to Pakistan or to Islamabad, it's very critical for a negotiator to recognize a fundamental fact. Negotiation succeeds only when you talk to the right person. In my view, the right person is Beijing, not Islamabad.
Sir, my name is Govind Rao. I am a student of Prasanna Kumar. So, sir, we have heard you very well. The entire globe is full of human beings. We have lunch, dinner and breakfast everywhere. These conflicts and challenges are created by us only. So, as a diplomat, as a futuristic, how do you think the world will go 50 years and forth? We are always quarreling with each other. We are always finding fault. Now China is silently investing in Ceylon, in Pakistan, in several other countries, as you already told about the European countries. Now it's one day they will take over the whole world. The thing is, why we want the neighbors to vacate and we come into their house? This is an aspect which diplomats may have an opinion to influence United Nations to have human way of life in the world. Why human way of living? Human way of Hinduism is a human way of life. It's not a religion. But why this religion has come? And the human being, how he can be developed to have a universal way of living in good relations, to have human happiness and joy. Thank you very much.
I think, sir, I have to request Professor Prasanna Kumar permission to give another talk, because the subject that you have raised lies at the core of, in my view, why we do what we do. And it's, if you go back to how I started, when I gave a definition of foreign policy, I actually left one element out of it. And the element that I left out, I intentionally left it out. So if it is a matter of pursuing our strategic national interests through negotiation without getting into conflict and war, is it not necessary for us to also ask whether the pursuance of national interest should not be within an ethical framework. In other words, are we able to justify all the means that we take in order to achieve our end objective? And for me, one of the most striking and horrific things that has happened is, you would recall that a few months ago now, an American citizen of Saudi origin was not only killed inside an embassy, his body was chopped up. CCTV cameras have recorded action. It was stuffed into a suitcase. I say all this on the based on the first phrase, an American national. Now, the entire American foreign policy, as you and I have read about it, says we have to protect American lives. And if an American life is abused, it will attract strong American action. There was also more than sufficient indication that there was a critical hand in Saudi Arabia itself for this action to have been executed. Yet, this does not disrupt the relationship between Washington and Riyadh, because it is based on the realism of oil. Human life is dispensable, especially if you want to make it dispensable. And I think it becomes very critical when you say that, should this not be the role of a diplomat? If you look at the city of VISAKHAPATNam, I ask you, whose role is it for this city to be according to your aspiration? Is it the role of the local bureaucrat? Is it the role of the media? Or is it not a collective aspiration and therefore a collective responsibility? I believe, sir, that the essence of any policy that we adopt, whether it's the relationship with each other or the manner in which a company operates or how we live our life, has to be based on recognizing and asking ourselves, what is it that we really want from it? I mean, there's a great saying, I think it is by Dale Carnegie, who said that companies succeed if they recognize that the customer is not as important as the employee. And unless you invest in the employee, the company as a whole will never deliver to the customer. Yet for us, the slogan we hear all the time is, the customer is king. That's not true.
Now, friends, after this fascinating exercise, I would pick up the thread from one point that Shri Amit Gupta ji made, China, talk to China. Now, we were kids when Nehru invited the Chinese and Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai was celebrated across the country. In schools and colleges, Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai flags were big and we were all in school at the time. But then remember, if China became a world power, as Ascot Reed very rightly said, India played the role of an honest broker. China was not allowed to get into international relations with Committee of Nations, but for India. It was India that played the role of an honest broker, said the Canadian High Commissioner to India. China was brought into focus by India in international relations. Therefore, I think we can relive those moments, absolutely. You referred to Joseph Nye, soft power, etc., etc. May I also take the liberty of mentioning to you, not that you do not know, but as a student of politics and administration, I firmly believe that, as the economist very rightly said, in India, there are two great problems. 5,000 elected representatives who do not do their job, and 5,000 IAS officers who overdo their job. And they said the Indian administration has been ruined by these two, the elected representatives and the bureaucrats, 5,000 IAS officers, self-perpetuating elite. Very modestly, Das Gupta ji evaded that question. He said, I chose IFS because I don't think you would have been a very successful IAS officer if you really chose it. Now, because that kind of bravado, that kind of, I watched them from very close distance. The difference between the IAS and the IPS and the IFS is absolutely nil. Wonderful officers in the police service. But the contempt they have for other services, the IAS people, most of them, it's a generalization. Ladies and gentlemen, a Vice Chancellor of Open University very rightly said, all generalizations are false, including this one. Therefore, this could be false. But then remember, this is a self-perpetuating elite. That is why. Now, when we talk about diplomacy, a little digression on this very pleasant occasion when the weather is good inside, when the talk is beautiful, when thoughts are really actuated, and something really worthwhile listening to, I am reminded of a very famous story, which is not a story, but it's a fact. 20th century's greatest diplomat was Henry Kissinger. And as a student, I was very angry with Kissinger because he insulted Jawaharlal Nehru, and he wrote rubbish about Nehru, Nasser and Tito when we were studying non-alignment in 1950s, when we were in the university. And he wrote absolute nonsense about these people. And this same Kissinger in 1956, he later retreated, backtracked, and then started recognizing India's role. Now, a book was written by a lady, I forget her name, in which the review of it I read, in which a scenario, it is a fact, it happened. In the 70s, Nixon was playing the role of an honest broker between China and the United States. Remember, the United States said in 50s, if the worst happens, we will give India a permanent seat in the Security Council, but not China. This is exactly what the Americans said. This is what Dulles said. If the worst happens, we will give India a seat in the Security Council, but not China. But the same United States, ping-pong diplomacy, Kissinger came to India. All of us know about that story. And the interesting part of the narrative is that Mao, Kissinger, and Nixon happened to meet. Nixon took his very famous ambassador Kissinger to Mao. And Mao said, whenever this fellow sees me, he literally shivers in his pants. Mao's aide later recorded. And it seems Nixon said, President Mao, Chairman Mao, I am introducing to you the greatest diplomat in human history. This is exactly what he said. The greatest diplomat in human history. What has he done? He was able to manage 300 girls without any problem and bring China and America together. And astonished, this is exactly what was written. The astonished Mao, it seems, brushed it aside and dismissed it as a kind of vulgar intervention by the American president. A very vulgar intervention by the American. This is all part of diplomacy. Diplomats can really narrate wonderful things. Moore wrote a book in which he said, a diplomat has to attend 975 parties in a year. I don't know how many you attended. And a diplomat, he said, a diplomat must have enormous gastronomic strength, stomach strength, drink, eat, and then survive and then do it. I am sure that this kind of diplomacy is a thing of the past. You are very right, absolutely right. I was really touched by your reference to Pakistan. Friends, how long can we live in hostility with Pakistan? Some time ago, South Asia Monitor, a website and a journal, asked me to write whether India-Pakistan cricket matches should be revived. Through Uday Bhaskar, I was in touch with South Asia Monitor. I am also happy to inform you that Uday Bhaskar's book with a foreword by Arun Prakash, former Chief of Staff, will be released probably next month or so by Center for Policy Studies. Now, at this particular point of time, I was asked to write about cricket matches being revived. Most people said no cricket matches with Pakistan. Then I said, how the hell you say that? Waqar Yunus, that fellow Waqar Yunus and Wasim Akram, the other fellow, the opening batsman, they're commentators in India, most loved. They go to Hyderabad, they came to Voltaire, they went to Delhi, wherever they go, they are treated as heroes. They do beautiful commentaries in cricket matches. They are treated as excellent players. And you have quarreled with Pakistan, isn't it? Then I said, cricket intermittently, music regularly are the best bridges of understanding between India and Pakistan. Cricket intermittently and music regularly. Because my icon, Bapu, the great film director, my icon, he once wrote a letter to me, today I saw God in my house. He is Mehdi Hassan from Pakistan. Because of it. What a beautiful, noble thought. Therefore, the question you have raised, my friend, is absolutely true, and very brilliantly it was answered by Amit Dasi. Yes, ultimately, do we always believe in a moment of weakness? I also feel very unhappy about China. China is overtaking. Everybody says China is miles ahead of you, miles ahead, miles ahead. You are at least catching up with China in population. Very short term, very soon. There's no problem at all. But then, a consolation to me, kind of fantasizing I did, when I read somewhere that the most unhappy nation in the world today is Japan. Because there are no people to work, no youngsters to take care of elders. Imagine life in old age, especially when there is no financial security, when there is no care, when there is no, from youngsters and the younger generation, what happens? Japan is the saddest country according to one analysis where people are very old and not many youngsters are seen. That is going to happen to China, in my opinion, in the next 20 years. Don't call it a sadistic wish. It is going to happen. China, after all, please remember in the history of civilization, these ups and downs we have seen. Greece, ancient Athens. Where was Austria? Austria was a great power. Where is Austria today? People will ask a question, what is Austria? Where is Austria? Our Vice Chancellor, V.S. Krishna, became a very good student in Austria because Austria was a center of civilization. Austria, Hungary, all these are famous powers, 500 years. Today, where are they on the map? Therefore, in this cycle, beautiful cycles that we witness in history, in my humble opinion, China will come back to senses and India should also come back to senses. And imagine for a moment, how long can we live with Pakistan as an enemy all the time? If we lose a cricket match, we jump for joy. If we lose a cricket match, they do all sorts of funny things. And then today there's a pathetic story in the Hindu that really made my eyes moist. 3 sisters. The story of 3 sisters, it was written. And the sister lives in Pakistan. Her son lives somewhere, works in India. And a phone call that sister was making to her sister in India from Pakistan, these were banned, these were prohibited. Now this kind of, I think, attitude, you will all agree with me that this is perhaps a little, you may not agree with me in the sense that let us not talk about peace, especially in the election year, but that's a different thing. But ultimately, I think we should remember the question you have so well raised. Ultimately, as Mahatma Gandhi very rightly said, Mahatma Gandhi, read the life of Mahatma Gandhi. His last wish was, I shall sign off with that. He said, on January 28th, I am going to Pakistan. Why? To fight for the cause of Hindus in Pakistan. I will be in Pakistan in the first week of February 1948. On the 30th of January, he was assassinated. On the 31st of January, we were all crying, listening to Melville de Mello's commentary on radio on the funeral of Mahatma Gandhi. We were kids. That is history. Therefore, Amit Dasji, you have also raised hopes about a bright future. And I am sure that if people like you continue to be active teachers, though not active diplomats, the world will be a very decent, very lovely place to live in. God bless you. Thank you very much, friends. A wonderful question, Amit. Thank you for the question you have raised. Yeah, please.
I think I'll just leave a thought with you. You know, the total number of people who die from war is significantly higher than the total number of people who die from terrorist acts. But very interestingly, the total number of people who die from traffic accidents is significantly more than the total number of people who die from terrorism. But you do not have a war on war. You do not have a war on traffic accidents. The number of people who die from diabetes is much higher than the number of people who die of terrorism. You do not have a war on sugar. You have a war on terrorism. And this war on terrorism is precisely what terrorists want, because they want a state machinery response. And the response will always be much higher than the action. This does not, however, mean that you should not have vigilance. This does not, however, mean that bus accidents and, RDX should be imported, exported, that soldiers should die. This does not mean that. This does not mean that you should not engage with people in Kashmir. I think it's important for us to recognize what the priority is.
Like an unpretty male air hostess, may I say, nice to have you on flight. Hope to see you soon again. Thank you. Now, Hamza Meji, my dear friend, the son of a very venerable Kasimi Sahib, will propose a vote of thanks. Once again, thank all of you for making this a very lively evening. Thank you.
On behalf of Center for Policy Studies, it's my privilege to thank Public Library as well. My privilege to thank Shri Amit Das Gupta ji for sparing his valuable time and being with us here today, this evening, and sharing his thoughts and experiences on the subject contemporary challenges to diplomacy. Your talk was very interesting and thought-provoking, sir. Thank you very much. Also like to thank Professor Prasanna Kumar for sharing his views in his most inimitable style, as always. Also thank the audience for their participation and presence in making this function a success. Thank you all again. Thank you, sir. Thank you.